How do you greet Shantae when you run into her in Paris? Well, how about by saying Enchanté?
Bruh.
Released in 2002, Shantae is a Metroidvania with side-scrolling platformer elements for the Game Boy Color. It was developed by WayForward and published by Capcom, and features a story that chronicles the titular half-genie Shantae's journey to stop the dreaded pirate Risky Boots and her gang the Tinkerbats from collecting 4 elemental stones to fuel a steam-powered weapon of mass destruction.
Party! It runs on steam!
Despite the fact that the plot feels like a riff on Avengers Infinity War, Shantae is an extremely playful and cartoony experience that's considered by many to be a bit of a swan song for the Game Boy Color. Having come out a year into the lifespan of the Game Boy Advance, it's since garnered an exorbitantly high price and is currently looked at as a cult classic, as well as received a number of sequels over the years. This video actually marks the first time that I've played through Shantae. While the game's been readily available through emulation or through the 3DS eShop, I've just never found myself that interested in giving it a shot. In fact, the only other time I've played a Shantae game before was last year when one of them was given away on Games with Gold for the Xbox One. And while I enjoyed that game quite a bit, I fell off of it pretty hard, and honestly, I can't even begin to tell you why. It just sorta happened, I guess. Catherine Full Body came out on Switch. Anyway, I've been really nostalgic for the Game Boy line of consoles lately. In fact, the Game Boy Advance was actually my favorite console of all time until fairly recently when it got usurped by the Nintendo Switch. Because of this nostalgia, I was pretty pumped when I found out that Shantae was making its way to the Nintendo Switch. And could you blame me? It's a gem from one of my favorite families of consoles being brought over to my current console of choice. Plus, Modern Vintage Gamer was even the lead designer for this port, and I literally watch his videos all the time, so that's awesome. But does it hold up? Because while Shantae is considered a gem that's achieved cult status and spawned multiple sequels, it's still a late era Game Boy Color game, and as such is running on some fairly limited hardware.
I'm limited by the technology of my time.
And even while playing the Game Boy Advance Enhanced version, which is what I did for this review, there's no denying that parts of this game are a little held back by the hardware that it's running on. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What is your favorite Metroidvania game? I'm personally not the biggest fan of the genre. However, it's not that I don't like Metroidvanias, I just haven't had the opportunity to play enough of them over the years to really get a good opinion on them. I will say though that as generic as it probably sounds, my favorite entry in the genre has to be Super Metroid. I grew up playing a lot of the original Metroid, as well as Metroid Fusion and Prime, and I distinctly remember playing through this game on the Wii Virtual Console while I was in middle school, and I've loved it ever since. In fact, not to get too deep or anything, I actually remember going through a lot of personal stuff back in the winter of 2014, and have the fondest of memories spending my nights playing through the game on an emulator while rewatching Twin Peaks. Feel free to drop an answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear a few Metroidvania recommendations. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Shantae takes place in the fictional world of Sequinland, where you're tasked with navigating through an overworld to enter 4 different dungeons and collect the elemental MacGuffins before Risky Boots can get to them first. Once you've completed the final dungeon, you're then tasked with throwing down with Risky Boots herself in a final confrontation to end the game. Because of this basic Metroidvania structure, Shantae specifically reminds me of something like Castlevania II for the NES. Like that game, it expects you to memorize the lay of the land and to rely on exchanges had with other characters and towns in order to figure out where you need to go next. It also features shops where your character can purchase combat upgrades as well as disposable items, which are even used by hitting up and hitting the attack button like in Castlevania. However, unlike Castlevania II, Shantae also is a lot more descriptive in its instructions, which makes it relatively hard to get lost while on your journey. There were a few moments when I needed walkthroughs in order to figure out where I needed to go next, but those were likely due to me not paying attention as opposed to the game itself being oblique. While generally regarded as a Metroidvania due to emphasizing exploration during dungeons and offering permanent power-ups to help you traverse the world of Sequinland, Shantae also carries a relatively linear structure that somewhat dulls and simplifies some of the genre's hallmarks. In other words, the game leans more towards titles such as Metroid Fusion than it does something like Super Metroid. I genuinely don't consider that to be a bad thing though, especially because of the game originally being developed for the Game Boy Color. If anything, this sort of game design makes it perfect for pick up and play sessions and helps prevent players from feeling like they need to draw a map on graph paper to properly navigate the world. Oh yeah, this game doesn't include a map. It's honestly not that bad though, as each of the parts of the world that you visit are all designed pretty uniquely and include everything from a desert area to a field, a swamp, or waterfalls. It also helps that Sequinland is a pretty small place that endlessly loops, which makes it easier to travel through. Along your journey, you'll come up against a wide variety of enemies that change from area to area, and in order to defeat them, you'll need to rely on the items or power-ups you've bought in shops or a whipping attack that you can perform with your hair. I honestly don't care for this attack though, as its range just feels pitiful. You have to get pretty close to your opponent in order to make contact with them, and for whatever reason, the hit detection doesn't always feel particularly accurate. While you can pick up some additional attacks from the shop in Watertown, I always felt like the hitboxes in Shantae were just a bit far from being reliable. Because of this, navigating from one dungeon to another doesn't feel particularly fun to me. It isn't terrible by any stretch of the word, and you can unlock the ability to fast travel between locations by collecting these super adorable warp squids in each dungeon, but it never quite clicked for me. When traveling from one dungeon to another, I'd usually try to avoid combat entirely and just try to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. But not that quickly, as the game suffers from some screen crunch that can make running into enemies at full speed pretty easy. It can also just as easily lead to Shantae falling into a bottomless pit or a spike that will instantly kill you and take away a life. The fact that the game has lives and bottomless pits also doesn't sit particularly well with me, as placing platformer conventions in a Metroidvania just doesn't feel right. If anything, the inclusion of both these elements feel like they're there with little other purpose than trying to justify why its counterpart is there to begin with. Lives feel like they're there to justify there being bottomless pits, while bottomless pits feel like they're there to justify a lives system. I'm actually kinda conflicted about this too, because I do ultimately like the fact that the game has lives, as it allows your character to respawn in the room you died in without resetting all of the enemies you've defeated or the damage that you've inflicted on bosses, as opposed to automatically getting a game over and needing to start over from your last save point. But it's still weird to see this in a Metroidvania. At least, I think it is. Again, I'm not that familiar with the genre, so I could just be blissfully unaware here. Anyway, back to traversing the world. Like I said earlier, it isn't terrible combat aside, and it does reward you with things like health bonuses if you're willing to stray off the beaten path and do some old-fashioned exploring. Similar to other Metroidvanias, you can use the power-ups you've obtained in dungeons in order to access previously unavailable areas, either by destroying an obstacle or by gaining a skill that allows you to climb or straight up fly past a barrier. In the case of Shantae, your power-ups come in the form of dances that can be performed in order to transform into one of several different animals. While I personally found the dances a bit harder to do than I thought they'd be, I really enjoyed this mechanic and would have loved to see more of it in the game. I honestly don't feel like there were enough moments in Shantae that had me trying to balance using more than one form at a time, and it feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity. I mean, yeah, the final dungeon of the game makes you do this a bit, but that's really about it. More often than not, you use one of your transformations for a little while, unlock a new one in a dungeon, and then promptly forget that the previous transformations in your arsenal even existed. Anyway, the real brunt of Shantae's fun for me comes in the form of its 4 dungeons. Each of them have distinct gimmicks and color palettes that make them feel unique. On top of that, they have the aforementioned transformations that shake up the gameplay in each location further, and also have boss battles that are never that difficult, but are pretty fun nonetheless. These dungeons are actually a really good take on the formula of a Zelda dungeon, and if I'm being frank, playing through this game really makes me wish that Nintendo would give making a side-scrolling Zelda game another shot, because Shantae proves that there's a lot of fun to be had with that formula. So now, onto the visuals. Shantae is freaking gorgeous.
Oh my god, even his shadow! Look at his shadow!
While many games such as Shovel Knight or the more recent Yacht Club Games release Cyber Shadow have tried to replicate the charm of an 8-bit adventure to admittedly awesome results, I genuinely think that Shantae still manages to blow them out of the water. This is especially impressive due to the game actually belonging to an 8-bit console, and as such, actually needing to be able to run on that hardware. While I played through the GBA enhanced version of the game, which expands the game's color palette, the base game honestly doesn't look that different from its enhanced counterpart. Regardless of which version of Shantae you end up playing though, you're in for an amazing looking game. Everything just feels alive and detailed here, from the overworld segments to the menu and game over screens, as well as the towns you can visit, which look like something that should belong on a freaking Super Nintendo and not an 8-bit handheld. And some of the details in this game are actually really subtle. For example, in one of the earlier dungeons, Shantae's color palette actually adjusts and changes to be a bit darker when you walk closer to a circular passageway that's further away from the area's key light. I really can't sing my praises about this game's visuals enough. Like I said earlier, I've been feeling particularly nostalgic for the Game Boy lately, and I was not disappointed by what was on display here, especially when playing this game on handheld mode on my Nintendo Switch. I also played this game on a 1440p monitor with an M Classic plugged into it, and it really holds up and is extremely easy on the eyes there, especially when you consider the fact that it was never intended to be looked at from such a high fidelity and large screen. And yeah, I know my setup was overkill for this one.
It hurts my eyes.
Yeah, that doesn't go away.
Shantae has the sort of boppy chiptune soundtrack that's becoming of a late era Game Boy game. While the Game Boy didn't have the best sound capabilities for its time, which is something that the Game Boy Advance also fell victim to, I've always been fond of what the hardware was capable of. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's something really nostalgic to a good Game Boy composition, and that thankfully Shantae is chock full of them. The OST hits its beats of sounding adventurous, playful, and outright eerie at the right times, and makes sure to include some catchy melodies that are sure to get stuck in your head. I'm especially fond of the song that plays whenever you enter a shop or building in a town. It's just so happy and totally fits the vibe of each of the game's towns so well. While not the best soundtrack on the Game Boy, or even the Game Boy Color specifically, Shantae has a bunch of great tunes on it and makes for a great listening experience. It's not perfect by any stretch of the word and can even sound a bit generic at times, but it does its job well and provides an accompaniment to the gameplay that always feels appropriate. I know I've been laying on the Back to the Future references pretty thick this week, but this last one really hits the nail on the head when it comes to Shantae's OST.
Great music!
Yeah, it's got a beat and you can dance to it.
So does Shantae hold up? Thanks to its great dungeon design, impressive 8-bit visuals, and fairly good soundtrack, I've gotta go with a resounding yes. While I did bring up the fact that the game has what I consider to be a fairly flawed combat system and also suffers from some screen crunch, I actually had a lot of fun with the game despite it, and can see myself doing a second, much more comprehensive playthrough in the future. But based off this first playthrough of the game, I still totally recommend Shantae, especially now that it's readily available on the Nintendo Switch and is still available on the Nintendo 3DS eShop. Simply put, at $10 and with the ability to play the Game Boy Color and the GBA enhanced version of the game, Shantae on the Nintendo Switch is a great value. And with that said and done, that brings us to the end of this video. If you haven't answered the question of the day yet and are feeling up to it, I'd love to hear a bit about what your favorite Metroidvania is down in the comments. And if you have any game recommendations for future videos, I'd also love to hear it down in the comments or over on Twitter or Instagram. You can find my profiles for both of those sites by following the links over in the description or by just searching for NichePlays on those respective sites. I hope you enjoyed this video, and that if you decide to check out Shantae for the first time, or just happen to give it a new playthrough, that you have a great time doing so. So yeah. Bye.